Welcome to Pharmacy in Focus, where I will be having pocket-sized conversations on current topics and interests relating to pharmacy and the wider health sector. My name is Shirena Vasan, bringing you Pharmacy in Focus on behalf of the Pharmaceutical Society of New Zealand. Welcome to this episode of Pharmacy in Focus. Today we are talking about pharmaceutical waste. I have often wondered what happens to unused medicine, the foils, the vials, the sachets, and the devices that are thrown away, and today we're going to find out. Our guest today is Sara Hanning. Sara is a registered pharmacist and senior lecturer in clinical pharmacy practice at the University of Auckland. Her research interests sit at the interface between pharmaceutics and clinical practice. She has worked extensively on the development of safe and effective dosage forms for children, and more recently has started to explore pharmaceutical waste management and minimisation strategies. Welcome, Sara.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. Now, to start off, can you tell me a little bit about your research into pharmaceutical waste so far?
Sure thing. So I guess this sort of interest in this project therefore started with a collaboration between some researchers at the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Auckland and Kanti's Manukau Health. And they had done some really cool things looking at capturing and deconstructing anesthetic gases in the operating room. And they were interested in, I guess, rolling out that idea to sort of more broadly pharmaceutical waste. Before we did that, we wanted to find out how much pharmaceutical waste is actually sort of around in New Zealand, and to kind of help us prioritize, I guess, what we wanted to focus on when we're looking at ways to manage it.
Excellent. And can you tell me, with regard to your specific research, what did you do? How did you find out the number of units that were in each waste bin, and what did you find?
Sure. So first of all, we had a look at how much pharmaceutical waste was sort of being generated in New Zealand over the last 5 or so years. And we did that, so we only looked at waste that's specifically going into that pharmaceutical waste stream. So that's pharmaceuticals that return to community pharmacies, or that are going into that disposal stream at hospitals. And yeah, so we had a look broadly at that to find out what kind of numbers we were looking at. And then we tried to get a snapshot of the kind of composition of the pharmaceutical waste. So to do that, we had a look in 12 bins over a 1-month period in Auckland. So that was about just under 6% of all of the pharmaceutical bins that were collected over that time, just to get a snapshot of the types of drugs and the sort of quantities that we were looking at.
Excellent. And when you looked into these 12 bins, what were the most common classes of medicine that you found?
Yeah, so we split the drugs. We classified them according to the World Health Organization classification system, and we found that just over a third of them belonged in the sort of nervous system group. So that included anti-epileptics as well as both non-opioid and opioid drugs. And that was followed by cardiovascular drugs, and then in sort of third place, I guess, with just over 20% was drugs that work on the alimentary tract and metabolism. So drugs for diabetes is included in that group.
Sure. And did you find any antibiotics or antivirals in there?
Yeah, so antimicrobials were sort of a class that we were quite interested in, because we know that the environmental impact of antimicrobials can lead to antimicrobial resistance, which is a sort of a global issue. So yeah, we found that 3.6% of what we found was classed as a general anti-infective for systemic use. So that was mostly flucloxacillin and amoxicillin.
Okay. And you also found that there was a 4-fold increase in medication that was returned between 2016 and 2020. And that sounds like a pretty whopping increase when you're looking at a 4-fold increase in 4 years. Do you know why this would have occurred?
Yeah, so we were quite surprised by the extent of the increase. We sort of, I guess, hypothesized it could be due to increases in like local manufacturing plants in New Zealand. So increasingly, when we have more companies manufacturing the pharmaceuticals here, then that is going to be associated with more waste at that sort of manufacturer end of the spectrum. It could also be that there are better processes, so the pharmaceutical waste is not maybe increasing, it's just going through that correct pharmaceutical waste stream as opposed to being treated as general waste or
Right. So
something like
in
that.
other words, that could be that more people are returning their unused medicines to pharmacies as well.
Yeah, I mean, we hope. Yeah.
Now let's move on to disposal methods. In New Zealand, pharmaceutical waste goes through an autoclaving process. Can you explain what autoclaving is?
Yeah, so autoclaving is a process of sterilization using steam. So it's really good at sort of killing off microbes. We use it a lot in the lab for, cleaning glassware, for example. In this context, it's used as a sort of a pre-treatment step before the waste then goes to landfill. So we know that it is good at sort of decontaminating the waste, but we don't really know what it actually does to the pharmaceuticals that are being treated. There might be some medicines that are sensitive to the heat and the moisture that's generated in this process, but we suspect that there's a lot that aren't, and so they remain unchanged through this process. And of course, when you think about packaging that's designed to protect the drugs from things such as moisture and temperature, then then it's quite possible that in terms of changing the pharmaceutical waste composition, that's very, very minimal through that process.
Okay. And in your paper, you also said that autoclaving isn't designed to deactivate chemicals or pharmaceutical waste, but it is there for the purpose of decontaminating it. What do you mean by decontaminating it?
Yeah, so the sort of the process of autoclaving is great for decontaminating if something's been and has sort of an infectious material on it, I suppose. That's not what the pharmaceutical waste stream is. There's sort of a separate infectious waste stream for those kinds of materials. So I guess it's an example of using some technology that is really good at doing one thing and sort of applying it to another, which maybe it's not designed for. So yeah, so we might end up with some sterile pharmaceutical waste, but that doesn't mean that that the pharmaceuticals inside have been changed in any way.
Sure. And just keeping that in mind, with your study, you looked at 12 bins. Can you tell me how many different types of products and units you found in those 12 bins?
Yeah, so in the 12 bins, we identified 475 different products, so a really broad kind of range of pharmauticals. And that was over 75,000 units of medicine. So we had, it was a summer student, not me that did it, but, sort of diving through and looking at what the contents of those bins really were, right down to individual tablets and capsules. And yeah, there were over 75,000 of those.
So in those 12 bins, and your study was in Auckland, within what was the 3 Auckland district health boards at the time, is that correct?
That's right. So in Auckland, the 3 district health boards have a metropolitan Auckland agreement. And so, yeah, so community pharmacies that sat within those 3 DHBs at the time were sort of included, I guess, in the study.
Great. So 75,000 units of medicine seems like quite a lot of medicine that you found, recognizing that it was around 6% of what goes into the waste stream, or into waste, I should say. And you've said that with the autoclaving process, it's not designed to deactivate, but it is to decontaminate. So in effect, you've got sterile medicine, I guess, or sterile packaging that then goes into landfill. And you've also mentioned that you've found some antibiotics or antimicrobials as part of your study as well. So what it sounds like to me is that as opposed to going through the general waste, say someone just throwing their medicine away and having it go to landfill, it's being autoclaved, so it's decontaminated, but then it's going into landfill anyway. What is the environmental impact of that?
Yeah, and so, I mean, obviously all waste has I suppose, negative environmental impact by definition. But by putting it into landfill ultimately, so it's sitting, in a pile on some soil, it gets wet, the moisture sort of leaches through into the soil via all the medicines and the things that are being landfilled, and that creates the liquid called leachate, which can then get into the environment via soil contamination, groundwater contamination. Where it does get treated as wastewater, it still can be discharged into waterways, and ultimately end up sort of in our food chain.
So there's a possibility that even the pharmaceutical waste that goes through this autoclaving process could end up, as you say, in our food chain, or potentially in our drinking water, for example. Would that be correct?
Yeah, and we, it's unclear the where it gets treated as wastewater, the leachate. It doesn't get tested before it is released, so we don't really know what kinds of volumes we're talking about. They're going to be, sub-therapeutic for sure, but we don't know what the sort of environmental or the sort of cumulative effect is going to be of that process.
Okay. Now let's move on to controlled drugs. There was a small percentage of controlled drug medicines that you found in your study. Was that surprising to you?
Yeah, it was. So I suppose most surprising was finding morphine sulfate in 7 of the 12 bins that we looked at. So it wasn't just a one-off kind of finding. It was right across. There were 273 units, so not an insignificant amount. We don't really know what the sort of, from a ecotoxicological perspective, what the impact of those in the environment might be. But we do know that controlled drugs such as morphine require clear documentation. Obviously, we didn't look at that, so it's possible that the pharmacies did have that they were documenting the controlled drugs, coming in and then going out for destruction. But what is clear is that, there are sort of pharmacies that are getting rid of controlled drugs simply by throwing them into that waste stream, and not by sort of rendering them irrecoverable first, such as is recommended. The Pharmaceutical Society suggests sort of breaking down those solid dosage forms and mixing them with detergent before disposing them. And so if that had been followed, we shouldn't have known what the drug was, essentially. So that was quite surprising. We also found some codeine and quite a lot of tramadol as well across multiple bins.
And let's move on to blister packs or foil packs now. You also found that around 30% of items were blister packed or in some form of adherence aid or compliance packaging. Can you tell me a little bit more about this?
Yep. So a lot of the drugs we looked at were in some kind of original packaging or adherence age packaging. I suppose, so like for adherence age, for example, you're going to have lots of drugs all in one little sort of pouch or bag. And yeah, that was really common, and maybe it reflects kind of a lean towards maybe older people, maybe that have lots of medicines and sort of multiple comorbidities and change medicines regularly. Yeah, we didn't look into sort of the why, I suppose, but it was interesting to see that only just over 2% were sort of loose tablets and capsules in the bins.
Wow. And when you mentioned blister packing, this is, for example, your medico packs, but it could also be the sachet rolls. So it's incorporating all of those. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So we know that these sorts of compliance and adherence aids are incredibly good at improving compliance. However, there is a lot that obviously is going into the pharmaceutical waste stream. And one thing about the autoclaving process is that the amount of weight, I guess, that goes into the autoclave is the same amount of weight that comes out. So it's not that anything is getting degraded at all. So
Yeah,
if
so yeah, the mass and the sort of the volume is remaining the same. That's right. Yeah.
Do you know if any of the manufacturing companies are looking into more sustainable packaging?
I know that a lot of manufacturers are looking at more sustainable sort of processes. So right from the manufacturer right through to packaging. Packaging is an interesting one because you know, you need the drug to be stable and I suppose safe. So you've got to balance those things. It's not quite as simple as simply, you know, minimizing your packaging and making it compostable or what have you. Pharmac, I think they put out a statement of intent. It's their current one, I think, and they identified packaging as something that they were looking at. And I mean, I think they've got such big purchasing power in New Zealand that they're in a great place to consider those sort of environmental impacts right along the supply chain, in addition to the other considerations around, you know, money, efficacy, and safety. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what comes of that, but they have definitely signaled preferences towards more environmentally sustainable packaging.
And that's great to hear. Let's now move to returned medicine. And you found that just under 30% of waste items had not expired. And I guess one of the reasons for that is people's medication had changed based on their condition and their needs. But this also doesn't include any medicine that might be sitting at home in people's cupboards or might be sitting in pharmacies never picked up. And I know there have been questions around the redistribution of unused medicines in the past, whether that's something that should be enabled or not. And I'm also aware that there are charities that do potentially send some donated medicines overseas. Do you know of any ways in which these unused, unexpired medicines could or are being redistributed and taken out of the pharmaceutical waste stream altogether?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. I guess, you know, when you're looking at the sort of the model of the 3 R's or the 5 R's or however many R's you want to look at, you're starting with reducing. So trying to reduce the number of unwanted medicines overall through, you know, prescribing and dispensing. And then next, I suppose, is reuse, which would sit above recover or recycle in the hierarchy. I suppose one of the main challenges with that is that even if the you know, the medicine's still in its original packaging, and often it won't be, it will be in a, you know, pharmacy bottle, or it would have, you know, been decanted in some way to suit that patient or person. You know, ensuring that it's been stored in an appropriate way and that it hasn't been adulterated at all. You know, it's quite challenging, and I think that's something that's sort of the biggest barrier towards opting for a reuse type model. In America, there are certain regions that are developing this, and essentially, you know, unwanted medicines that could still be used get sent to a dedicated place, and they get tested and then redistributed into the sort of the same region, I suppose. So they're not being sent offshore. But yeah, so there is potential, but I think it's not as simple as simply taking an unwanted medicine from one person and giving it to somebody else. I think there needs to be a check, and ideally we'd be reducing the number overall of unwanted medicines as a first sort of step.
Great, thank you for that. And I also read that in Australia, there's a government-funded initiative called the National Return and Disposal of Unwanted Medicine Scheme, where people are encouraged to return unwanted medicines to pharmacies. Whereas in the USA, although you have mentioned certain areas that might be doing something differently around the redistribution, the other parts of USA, they recommend disposing of medicines at home, such as in household waste or down the toilet. Now, those are quite different methods of disposing of your unwanted medicines. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so they're kind of at the opposite ends. I think so. Starting with the FDA guidelines around disposing of medicine down the toilet or with your household rubbish, I think that comes from a perspective of sort of least harm. So we know that it's not ideal to have unwanted medicine sitting around a house. It can lead to confusion, accidentally taking the wrong medicine. It can lead to children accidentally or pets taking the medicine, and so it can lead to harm. And so I think it's sort of a method of getting it out of people's homes in the easiest way, even though that's not the most ideal. Australia's model is really good in that it utilises pharmacies similar to what we do in New Zealand, but they've got a really big drive where they're really advertising, and they've centralised it. Their website's got a little counter that tells you how many tons of medicine they've disposed of, and it's always being updated. So they've got a really interactive, sort of engaging program, I suppose, that they've developed to try and get the public on board, as well as health professionals, to try and get rid of our unwanted medicines from people's homes.
Excellent. And do you have any thoughts on how people in New Zealand could be encouraged to take their unused and no longer needed medicine to a pharmacy or maybe even a hospital for disposal?
Yeah, I mean, I think public awareness of this as an option could be improved. A lot of people, we know that the vast majority of people do not return their medicine. So one study that was done back in 2009, but in New Zealand, looked at this and found that less than a quarter of the 450 or so participants that they interviewed actually returned their unwanted medicines to pharmacies. So I think, a lot of sort of education around what to do and some of the risks with leaving them. I think there are a lot of people out there who like to hold on to their medicines just in case, or so I think so I think education in that space. A lot of pharmacists are quite sort of time poor, and so I think it has to be a really centralized system that encourages the public to return the medicines to their sort of local pharmacy, but that doesn't greatly increase, I suppose, the workload of those pharmacies.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So public awareness, maybe a campaign, a public campaign. I really do like the idea of what they're doing in Australia. We can see the tons of medicine that has been returned. That might be a way of engaging the public as well. But as you say, also making it efficient from a pharmacy's perspective, so they're not having to spend an increased amount of time trying to figure out what to do with all the medicine that is being returned as well. So finding a balance there.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sara. This has certainly given some insight into what happens to medicine that is returned to pharmacies and hospitals, and may have given some people some food for thought on the impact unused medicine is having, and as well as the packaging and what impact that has on our environment. In a future episode with Sara, we're going to be discussing cytotoxic waste and how cytotoxic waste is disposed of quite differently to the other pharmaceutical waste we have spoken to her about today. So thank you for joining us again today, Sara, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Great. Thank you for having me.